Hello and welcome to our channel. We are James and Karen. This is the site of the Battle of Flodden Field. After the van has been set up, ready for staying overnight, we are going to take you on a tour of the battlefield. Situated in the car park, there's an information board which illustrates the battlefield map, and there's a QR code for you to scan and download the tour of the battlefield. The Battle of Flodden Field was fought on the 9th of September in 1513 between the Kingdom of Scotland and the Kingdom of England, and it resulted in an English victory.
Henry VIII of England invaded France in the Battle of the Spurs during the War of the Holy League on the 16th of August, 1513. Bound by an old alliance with France, King James IV of Scotland answered a call of assistance from the French King Louis XII.
While waiting for the English to arrive, the Scots set up fortified defences on Flodden Hill. Not wishing to meet the Scottish army from its advantageous position, the Earl of Surrey instead outflanked his adversary and cut off King James's path of retreat to the north. In a hasty decision, King James IV ordered his army to move from Flodden Hill to Branxton Hill.
In front of us is the Scottish position up on Branxton Hill, facing towards the English on Piper's Hill. The battle commenced late in the afternoon of the 9th of September when the Scots opened fire.
It was dull, damp and muddy, having rained for most of the day, and in the following hours these fields would become the scene of bloody carnage. The battle had just begun, and you find yourself in the English lines. Those around you are armed with billhooks and halberd, short stout weapons which can be thrust or swung to a deadly effect. The Scottish army is spread along the skyline, identified by the heraldic arms of its commanders. You can see the white smoke from the first volley of their heavy cannon, which they have dragged through the mud from their position of Flodden Hill, just beyond the horizon. They struggle to find range, and many of their shots fizz harmlessly overhead, but the lighter and more manoeuvrable English guns return fire with a greater effect. The forces of Hume and Huntley on the Scottish left advanced down the slope and engaged the English lines under the command of Edmund Howard. Hume and Huntley's attack proves devastating to the English right flank, commanded by Edmund Howard. He is greatly outnumbered, and the only timely arrival of Dacre's horsemen saves the day. Having witnessed the success of their comrades, the troops of the Scottish centre advance with confidence.
At this stage of the battle, the forces of Hume and Huntley are already leaving the field, having won their part of the fight. The pikemen of the Scottish centre are now joining battle, but the boggy ground in the dip below will prove to be their undoing. They lose momentum, and the tight formation on which the pike depends, they are set upon by English billmen, whose weapons are much better suited to close quarter fighting. King James and his noblemen troops soon descend from hereabouts to suffer a similar fate, and the arrival of Stanley and his archers with a flanking attack to the east seals the battle's outcome.
Scottish division outnumbers that of Surrey's, but they all will soon be reinforced from the English centre, and Surrey must act quickly. King James had ordered the advance of the next formation line under the commanders of Errol, Crawford and Montrose, after observing the triumph of Hume and Huntly's attack earlier.
King James and his troops attack in turn, but after initially pushing back the English lines, they run into similar difficulties during close combat. The arrival of Stanley and his archers with a flanking attack from the east seals the fate of the King of Scotland. Well, we're now walking up Branxton Hill, the way the Scottish came down. They had their long 14-foot pikes, but as they reached the bottom, it became a quagmire of mud, and the front ranks couldn't maintain order or formation, which made their fighting pikes less effective. Not only that, without the men behind realising that the men in front were having problems, they carried on, crushing the men in front and pushing them into the quagmire. Many were simply drowned in the mud, and then the men behind had problems, of course, trying to negotiate pikes and bodies. The irony is, if the Scots had maintained their position and the English had actually come down into the quagmire, the final result of the battle may have been very different. We have now reached the top of Branxton Hill, and from the Scottish perspective, the battle may have looked as if it was going pretty well. The pikes are relentless and unstoppable, and many of the English panic and flee the field. This is a vantage point for King James and his men, but what cannot be seen from here is the Englishman on horseback, galloping through the valley, just north of where Branxton village now stands, and about to attack the Scottish vanguard in an outflanking manoeuvre.
King James has been watching the approach of the division led by the Earl of Surrey, the English commander. Their commander, the Earl of Surrey, has deployed his forces along the ridge ahead of you, where the village of Branxton now stands. There has already been an artillery exchange, but the heavy Scottish guns dug in to the left of here have proved ineffective in comparison to the lighter, more manoeuvrable English field guns. Nevertheless, Hume and Huntly on the Scottish left had advanced down the slope and inflicted a bloody nose on the English right flank under the command of Edmund Howard. Those around you will soon advance too. Many are armed with long pikes, a weapon which has proved devastating in battles elsewhere in Europe.
The English artillery were small, light field guns which were very manoeuvrable with light iron and lead composite balls. The Scottish had massive field guns actually taken from Edinburgh Castle, which, while devastating if they hit their target, were mostly off target. The other issue is the English field guns could be reloaded within about 3 minutes. The Scottish guns took up to 45 minutes to prime, reload and fire. So as you can see, the Scottish were at a disadvantage, even though looking at the lie of the land geographically, it feels that the English were at a disadvantage.
the Scottish centre of some 8,000 pikes, commanded by Earls Errol, Crawford and Montrose, holds a position here on Brankston Hill. Weather conditions are appalling and visibility is limited, but we have seen our vanguard's early success on the left flank, and so confidence is high. Now is the time for us to move forward and take the battle to the English centre. We advance in tight, close, ordered formation, but silences in step to a single drum beat. All starts well, with steady progress, and we expect soon to see our compatriots in our vanguard begin their attack on the flank of the English centre. But as our ranks descend the hill, the weight of marching feet on the saturated ground churns the surface into mud. Men start to slip and the pikes begin to waver. Some are dropped, men trip and fall, and gaps appear in our tight formation. Conditions worsen, and when we reach the valley, a quagmire of knee-deep mud halts our forward movement.
Right, these pikes which we've been talking about, these amazing weapons, had been brought to England by the French. There had thousands of them, several thousand, but whereas it required months or even years of training for these weapons, the Scots literally only had a few weeks to familiarise themselves with these fearsome weapons.
Those in the rear press on, compacting our ranks and creating confusion. From here you look up to see a mass of soldiers atop the small ridge ahead. The English centre holds the higher ground, and from them comes a narrow storm. Men around you are falling, some being crushed and trampled to drown in the mud. Fighting is hand to hand, hard, bloody and brutal. The few that are able, in singles or small groups, to break through the mud and find their 18-foot long pikes are now an encumbrance rather than a useful weapon. And where is the vanguard? Casualties are heavy, with Lords Errol and Crawford and Montrose amongst the Scottish losses. The English centre remains sufficiently intact. It's unclear whether James IV had seen difficulties encountered by the battle a little earlier, but he followed nonetheless, making his way towards Surrey's formation. And now the King of Scotland is in mortal peril. He stands alongside his men to fight and shares the risk of the battle. "3,000 hard-fighting Highlanders, armed not with pikes, but with battle axes and two-handed claymores."
As they move to rescue their king, many are killed in a deadly arrow storm, a devastating flank attack by Edward Stanley's archers.
English troops were under orders that no prisoners were to be taken, which would explain the high mortality rate amongst the Scottish nobility.
You are now in the heart of the battle. Along this dip, which was then an area of undrained marsh, the two armies came face to face, and it is here that most of the fighting, killing and dying takes place. It's difficult to imagine the carnage on that day, but after a matter of just a few hours, an estimated 4,000 men lie dead or dying, amongst them the Scottish king and most of his nobles. The rate of slaughter exceeds some of the most horrific battles in the Somme in the First World War. It was in this dip that the Battle of Flodden was decided. The advance of the close quarter pike formations of the Scottish faltered in the heavy claying mud of the marshland, and as the ranks pressed in from behind, footing was lost and their formations fell apart. At this point, the English weighed in with their billhooks, thrusting, cutting and hacking at the Scottish lines. The Scottish pikes were totally unsuitable for this type of combat. It is thought that King James died on the field only yards from this point. His army's fate was finally sealed when Stanley's archers arrived through Crookham Dean and launched a flanking attack which prevented their escape. The day belonged to Surrey and England. A visit to Flodden Field Visitor Centre is well worth a trip prior to going up to Flodden Field. It's actually designated as the world's smallest visitor centre. The tour takes maybe 2 hours. As a walk, it's well worth doing. I compare it actually with Bannockburn 199 years previously, when Robert the Bruce won a decisive battle with a smaller army by actually forcing the English into a disadvantage. In the same way, this battle was won by Surrey's very clever outflanking the Scots and coming in from the north, which must have been unsettling because they were literally cut off from their homeland, and it must have felt quite unsettling. And better weaponry in terms of use on the battlefield rather than heavy guns which were really only suited to fixed positions